Hello everyone. The composer that I picked to talk about next is one of the most important composers of the 20th century, just in terms of his influence on other composers, and that is Igor Stravinsky. So he lived from 1882 to 1971, and he is a Russian composer, kind of continuing the theme we had going in some of the other videos that Russian composers really didn't enter onto the scene of music history until fairly late in the second half of the 1800s, but then there's lots of important ones in the late Romantic period and the 20th century. So Igor Stravinsky is probably among the most important of those Russian composers. And he grew up in Russia, but in his early adulthood, in his 20s, spent time in France, and was actually, since this is about the time that in the around 1914 that World War I began, and then shortly after that you had Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. He was actually between 1914 and the 1960s was not able to go back to Russia. So he spent many years in France and Switzerland, and then actually spent the latter part of his life from the late 1930s on in America, mostly in Los Angeles, but then a little bit in New York City at the end of his life. So a very international composer, just because of circumstances that he wasn't able to spend most of his life in Russia. But there are basically three periods of his kind of compositional career, and you'll see that with other artists too. I think Picasso's really famous. The painter Pablo Picasso is really famous for having different periods of his artistic style, and you can see that really easily with a composer like Picasso, because there's he has a blue period where everything's blue, or a pink period where everything's pink. But Stravinsky had three different periods in his career that are maybe a little bit more difficult to hear the differences and to discern if you're not quite trained in music, but still three different periods. The first is his Russian period, where his music was influenced by Russian music and culture. His second period is called the neoclassical period, where his music was really influenced by Baroque and classical music. And then his last period is called his serial period, so not like breakfast cereal, but Serial. And that's something I'm going to talk about in the next video, serial music, but it's very modern music. So very different from the music he had written before. But the music he is by far best known for is music from very early in his career during his Russian period. And this is particularly three ballets that he wrote in 3 years in a row, 1910, 1911, and 1912, so when he was still in his late 20s, early 30s. And these are ballets that are inspired by Russian culture and music. And they were written for a ballet company that was called the Ballet Russe, and that's French for Russian ballet. And the reason it's in French is that it was a ballet company that performed in France, performed Russian ballets in France. So you have to remember at this time, in the early 1900s, that Russian culture was seen by countries in the west of Europe, like France, as being very exotic, because people just hadn't been exposed to it very much. Russia's so far away from France that it was all very new and interesting and exotic to the French. And so this ballet company was formed to kind of take advantage of that interest and put on ballets by Russian composers inspired by Russian culture, very Russian sounding music, and so Stravinsky was a big part of that. So he wrote three ballets, or he's best known for those three ballets: The Firebird in 1910, Petrushka in 1911, and The Rite of Spring in 1912. And we're actually going to look at The Rite of Spring on Community Day at the very end of the year, when we do orchestra and composers. And I would say The Rite of Spring is Stravinsky's most famous work, his most influential work, just a huge sort of landmark piece in not just 20th century music, but all of music history. So we'll look at that then, but I still thought Stravinsky was worth spending a little bit of extra time on for those who are interested, just because he's such an important composer and wrote such important music and really good music too. So the piece that I wanted to focus on in this video is The Firebird, written in premiered in 1910. And the link that I put up for this ballet contains the whole ballet. So, and it's less than an hour long. It's fairly short, and the whole thing is good, kid friendly. I think kind of a fun piece. So if you like it, just, you know, you could go ahead and watch the whole thing. But I picked a selection from the last part of the ballet. So, but I'll kind of give some background information, and then describe the part that I picked to watch. I'll just kind of tell the whole story of it. So, it was created kind of an amalgam, a collection of elements of multiple different Russian fairy tales put into one, but all inspired by Russian stories. So the whole thing takes place in this enchanted garden that belongs to this magical being named Kashe. And Kashe is, he's magical, and he's very, very old, but he can't die. His soul is contained in this egg, and the only way to kill him is to destroy that egg. So in this magical garden, there are several different groups of beings, I guess you'd say. Kashe has this army of monsters to do his bidding. He turns his enemies into stone, so there are these stone statues. And there are also these princesses. There's these 13 princesses who he's holding captive. They're good, they're beautiful, but they're his prisoners. And then there's also this magical bird called the Firebird, and she's kind of the heroine of the story. She has the ability to enchant others, to put them under her control. So the ballet begins with Prince Ivan chasing the Firebird into Kashe's garden, and he catches her, and in return for her freedom, she gives him one of her feathers, which he can use to call on her later if he needs her. So she flies away, and then in come these princesses who are Kashe's prisoners, and the prince sees them, and he falls in love with one of them. But then the gates open up, and Kashe's monsters come in, and they catch Ivan. Kashe comes in, and he's about to turn Ivan into stone, but then Ivan pulls out the feather, and in comes the Firebird. So that's the point at which I'd suggest starting to watch if you don't want to watch the whole thing. So the Firebird comes in and puts this enchantment on everyone in the garden, causing them to dance. They're kind of under her control dancing. So they dance this very fast, lively dance. It's called Infernal Dance. And then at the end of it, in exhaustion, they fall down asleep. So then the music becomes very quiet and slow, and that is the Firebird's lullaby, keeping them all asleep. And then after that, Prince Ivan comes in with the egg containing Kashe's soul, and he throws it on the ground. So Kashe dies, and he disappears. The monsters disappear, and then the princesses are freed, and the statues are turned back into people, and it just so happens that these people are 12 men to pair up with the princesses, leaving the one princess left that Ivan is in love with, and so they pair up as well. And so then the ballet ends with this really triumphant, beautiful music as they're celebrating their freedom, and the sun comes up, and it's very beautiful. So this is just a very Russian piece of music, obviously based on Russian stories, but also the music just sounds really Russian. Stravinsky studied with Rimsky-Korsakov, who we looked at in a previous week, and he was, in this particular composition, Stravinsky was really influenced by Rimsky-Korsakov's music. Rimsky-Korsakov loved Tchaikovsky. I think just the fact that he's writing ballet music as a Russian composer shows kind of some of the influence Tchaikovsky had on him, but just really Russian music, which was kind of the rage in Paris. And I think it's just a fun piece of music. and a good introduction to Stravinsky. So just kind of get the sound of this music in your mind, because it's a ballet by Stravinsky, and only 2 years later he writes The Rite of Spring. So when we listen to that, you can hear, when we listen to that at the end of the semester, you can hear just how different The Rite of Spring is. But I hope you like the Firebird. It's a fun piece of music by Igor Stravinsky.